Welcome. This is your first PowerPoint presentation in history, U.S. history up to 1877. And every week you'll have a PowerPoint presentation with a worksheet, and that will be graded. It's considered one of your assignments. And it's very important. Let me give you a little bit of advice on these. Your homework is basically a textbook assignment, as you know, and also the PowerPoint. And occasionally there'll be some other presentation assignments like an outside reading or something of that nature. But a couple suggestions on how to be successful on this. First think of the PowerPoints as another text. There's a lot of material on them. You don't really need me for that in many cases, but I will make comments about some of the slides and tell you why they're important. And you should take notes on those. It'll save you a lot of time later, because when you look at the PowerPoint worksheets, many of them are referring to points that I made personally on the computer, on the PowerPoints themselves. So if you don't take notes on them, you'll have to go back and look at the PowerPoint again and so on. So that is the best way to do well on the PowerPoint worksheets. The other thing to bear in mind is try not to look stuff up. When I grade you on the material I gave you. So if you get into the habit of thinking you're taking a shortcut by looking something up on Wikipedia, what usually happens, students do not do well. Number one, they end up copying something down they don't really understand. And very often I'm looking for the importance of a topic. Anyone can look up a topic and see what it is, the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the thing that your grade would be based on, can you tell me the impact of that battle, for example, or the impact, how it changed things, how it led to future events, whatever it might be. And that is what you'll get from me. So sometimes students think they can do shortcuts and they look something up in Wikipedia and they find they're actually marked down because they're not really answering my questions and so forth. So please bear that in mind. And the other thing is, another way students hurt themselves is don't lose sight of the story. There's a great story in history. In fact, more than ever, people need to know history. History is think of it as, if you don't know history, it's a form of amnesia or cultural illiteracy. You all know how to read, but if you don't know, there's certain events and topics that just an educated person in this country should know about. And once again, if you don't know history, you can't put things that are happening today in context. And I'll be constantly making connections to today's world with this course. In fact, it's really kind of an exciting time to be teaching this, because we'll be going into the foundation of our Constitution, impeachment. We'll be going into things like Electoral College. And as you can see, most Americans really do not understand how they work, but you should have a heads up on them after this course. And the other important thing I'll stress a lot is, which sometimes people don't have time for, is be careful of your sources. I'm a history professor. I love history. I feel like I made a career out of a hobby, but I also know enough to check my sources, and not to, the worst source you can use sometimes is just getting something offline, unfortunately. And you should always, before you accept something or believe it, you should always check it out with other sources. Where did that article you just read come from? And there's a lot of false news out there, as you know, right now. So you have to be very careful to be, a lot of Americans don't read newspapers today. If you're liberal, then some of the best newspapers that are constantly checked and respected the world over are things like the New York Times, for example, Washington Post. And if you're conservative, Wall Street Journal is a very good newspaper, for example, if you're conservative, or National Review is a very good conservative magazine. I don't expect you to read these things, but if you're looking for articles online, these are some of the newspapers, for example, or magazines that you should be conscious of, and not some stuff out there that's really not based on any real facts or anything. So as we get started, I just want to make you realize, don't lose sight of the story. I'm only half joking when I say, before you do your homework or you read the text or whatever, think of the story behind it, because that'll help you remember what's important. You should maybe start your homework by saying, once upon a time, a long time ago, and actually your grade will go up if you do that. And once again, sometimes students don't want to read the things carefully. They just look things up and they end up not understanding what they're writing down. So trust me on this and you'll do okay. Also, there will be, I'll have some Zoom meetings set up during the week. I will only be on those if you tell me you're going to be there. Last semester, I didn't make that clear, and I'd go online and no one would show up, and I'd be tying up my time for nothing. But I'm always willing to meet with you, either through email or we can have a Zoom meeting. So I'll have a Zoom meeting usually on Wednesdays, afternoon and evening, in case you work. And of course, if it's not convenient for you, you can always just tell me you want to meet anytime, and I'm more than happy to do that. So let's get started. And now the nice about the PowerPoints, they're long sometimes, but you don't have to sit there and watch the whole thing. You can break it up, you can slow it down, take a break. So bear that in mind, and that should help you a great deal, okay? So we're going to start off with the first part. This is one, I'll call it the, there it is. Before we can get into US history, we have to set the stage. Remember I said there's a story here. What was the world like in 1492? And of course, 1492 is associated with Columbus. And look at the area in purple. That was the world that Europeans knew. Look how small Europe is on this map compared to Africa and Asia and so forth. And my main point in this, and this, remember I said you should be taking stuff down that I say, is that Europe was one of the weaker areas, regional areas in the world. The great civilizations actually were in Asia, China, and the Islamic world here in the Middle East, and even Africa had sophisticated civilizations, and so did South America and even North America, but Europe didn't know about this. And it's that the fact that Europe was sort of like isolated and didn't have a lot, it was that thirst to get a hold of goods from China, for example, that made them want to try to go across the Atlantic Ocean and hopefully find China. Of course, they were shocked when they found these two major continents. Can you imagine what it'd be like today if we found a world, another whole world just off our vistas in space and had a sophisticated civilization? These people would have been just as shocked. Okay. And here's what we call the famous Silk Road. This is how much of the goods from China came into Europe. You can see the Roman Empire on the left. And it's called the Silk Road because silk here stands for all the products coming from China, which you'll see. We think of globalization being something just today, but that's not true. There was globalization back in the 1300s and even earlier, even during the Roman Empire. The Romans were trading with goods that came from China. Okay, the major world civilizations in 1300, and Europe was not one of them. Okay, that's my main thesis here, because this tells us why they eventually will find, in the hope of finding China, they do find a new world, and that's where American history starts. Okay, before Columbus, ancient cultures in America. Now this is a good example. You don't really need me for this. I'm putting this down to make a point that there were major civilizations here. And it's important for you to understand this because later a lot of Europeans will look upon Native Americans as being primitive, for example, and it's really a misnomer. So, okay. Hunters and gatherers, first people may have come to America 40,000 years ago. We think, you may have remembered learning this in American history, maybe in high school, that during the Ice Age, people from Asia came over to North America over what we call the land bridge, when Alaska was connected to Asia. And some people also believe that many of them did not come from that land bridge, but actually came by sea in primitive boats, and over thousands of years worked their way across up and down the North and South America. Maize or corn, the first plants to be domesticated. And you're going to see a documentary on the world before 1492 that will go into more detail on this. And of course, the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas were major civilizations in Mexico and Incas in Peru. Native American societies in 1400. Native Americans adapt to live in diverse physical settings. They found ways to adapt in the cold, what today is Canada, and to the sweltering jungles of the Amazon, okay? Certain North American, American native tribes are famous for like the totem pole or whaling, and they lived in large communities, especially in California. The Southwest, the Pueblos, lived in multi-stored houses. Many of you have had the opportunity to go to New Mexico and Arizona, would have seen this type of dwelling. And here, the Eastern Woodlands, the Iroquois hunted, fished, gathered food. In the Southeast, like the Cherokees, they lived off the land as well, okay? Now, pre-Columbian culture, there's a map showing you basically where. I don't know how good your geography is, so hopefully this helps. But there's the Maya area, and where you see the yellow Mexico, that would be Aztecs. And down here, you can't really see it good, would be the Incas. Occasionally, I'll underline certain things. And once again, you don't really need me for anything here, I think. Just read it carefully. Here's a new vocabulary word for you if you don't know it. Indigenous. Indigenous refers to the original settlers, shall we say, who live in that area. So you notice it says includes the history of American indigenous cultures. That would mean Native Americans. Okay. And if you look at the very bottom part, what's underlined, many pre-Columbian civilizations established characteristics and hallmarks, which included permanent or urban dwellings, agriculture, civic and monumental architecture, and complex social hierarchies. The whole point here, and once again, I want you to maybe jot this down, is these were sophisticated civilizations in their own right, okay? And once again, you don't really need me. You can read this at your own leisure. If you think I'm going too fast, once again, just stop the PowerPoint. You know where that button is to pause, and you can read at your own leisure, okay? Once again, the very bottom part, where they persist, the societies and cultures which are descended from these civilizations may now be substantially different in form from that of the original. However, many of these people and their descendants still uphold various traditions and practices which relate back to these earlier times, even combined with those that were more recently adopted. I think of the Mexican traditions of the Day of the Dead, for example, which has predates many Christian aspects of that. Just as one example. And this is what we think Tenochtitlan looked like. This would be what is today Mexico City. All this, of course, will later be buried, shall we say, by the Mexico City that the Spanish built. They destroyed much of this, but archaeologists today are still finding, obviously, remnants of this civilization. And this was a major city. This was one of the largest cities in the world. And you can imagine how shocked the Spanish were to find a city of this nature. Now we move more into our area, the Northeast and Southeastern United States. Once again, various tribes, you may even recognize some of the names. And think of just like Connecticut, Massachusetts, for example. These are Native American names, okay? Cahokia. Now this is really very fascinating. I'm obviously a lot older than you, but when I was in high school, I never heard of this. No one ever taught me about Cahokia. I knew about the Aztecs and, for example, the Incas, but not this. It wasn't until I was a teacher that I actually started to learn more about this, which says a lot, I think, about how the way history was taught when I was young. And so 1,000 years before the European contact, they had these like gigantic mounds called Cahokia, which is the largest. And they're in actually near what today would be St. Louis, Missouri, and the middle part of the United States. So I wanted to show you, now this is a modern day picture, but look at this mound. This is what it looks like today. Today, these are all protected areas. We call this Mesoamerica. It's a UNESCO World Site, meaning it's protected. You can go and visit, there's stairways there. This is what we think it would have looked like back then. It's, as you can see, there's multi-dwellings and a fairly sophisticated urban situation here. Notice what they call the Grand Plaza, which would have been obviously like a marketplace. And this is the site in Ohio. Remember I said it's like in our Midwest? Kind of gives you an idea where these are. And it's not just one area. You can see there's quite a few mounds. And this is what we think underneath those mounds, what was there. You see burial sites, for example. Very sophisticated. And here's a larger area. As you can see, they go all the way down to South America. To the southern states of the United States. And this is what we found in one area, a priest with ceremonial flint mace and severed sacrificial head. So we think it's a modern day rendition of what we found. This is how a modern artist might think how they dressed and how they looked. And obviously the sacrificial head and flint mace were things that were found in the sites and so forth. So the trade links, North American peoples promotes the sharing of ideas and cultures. And this is a very important part because it's going to cause a major conflict with the Europeans. Native Americans base their identity on a strong attachment to the land, which that can be neither traded or sold. So later, when Europeans, Americans, want to buy Indian land, they had a hard time understanding how can you sell something that's part of your spiritual heritage that belongs to everyone. And this will be one of the major problems that will lead to a disaster between Native Americans and Europeans. Religion, great belief in a great spirit. I know that's rather vague, but remember, this is another cause of contention because Europeans, when they come over in 1492, are Catholics. There's no Protestants yet, meaning if you're today, some of you are Baptists or Methodists or belong to any other Christian church. They did not exist in 1490. It was just a Catholic church. The Catholic Church believes, of course, for a Christian, that Jesus is the Son of God. He was crucified, died, and was buried. And on the third day, he arose again. And according to scripture, he will come again. This is what a Christian is. A lot of Americans, unfortunately, do not know what a Christian is, or they think if they're Protestant, the Catholics aren't Christian, or if you're Catholic, you think Protestants aren't Christian. We'll get into this in a second PowerPoint. But this idea for Europeans that they believed in Great Spirit, to them, that was like saying they believed in the devil, because to them, only Christians could go to heaven. Only Christians had the right concept of what God was. Okay. Now, what were the major civilizations? This is very important because most Americans do not know this. By taking this course, you're going to know more than 99% of the American people, unfortunately, but it's true. And one of the great myths is that Africans were barbarians, that Africans came out of the jungle, and until the white people brought them to America as slaves, we gave them religion, and that they were better off as slaves than they would have been back as living a primitive existence in Africa. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Okay. Then major kingdoms, meaning kings, obviously, and that they were involved in trade and tribute. Okay. They lived in villages where life centered on the extended family. That means it's not just the mother, father, and children, but mother, father, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. Trade, bring goods, ideas of the major religion, Islam, which was founded by the Prophet Muhammad. And this is going to be the major religion that will take hold in West Africa. And once again, it's through the trade routes and their connection with Islam. The Portuguese were the first to trade with markets and African goods, but they also introduced, this is where the black slaves came from. Portugal was one of the first Europeans to bring slaves into Europe and eventually into the New World. Now, this does not look like a primitive civilization. This is one of the oldest universities in the world, and it's in Timbuktu. And they were as advanced as anything in Europe, okay? And that's something you do want to remember. Except they were richer. There are some African kingdoms. You can see there's quite a few. Each one, obviously, almost think of it almost the way Europe is, or maybe the United States with 50 states. This is West Africa here. And this is the Islamic world. So you can see the connection, how Islam spread to this area. There's just another picture of them. You may recognize some of the names, but none of these are modern day African states, for example, except for Ghana. Okay. Kingdom of Kush, which was just south of what we know is Egypt. And a lot of you know about ancient Egypt, right? The pyramids, the mummies, that whole stuff. And as a young child, I think all kids are fascinated by ancient Egypt culture, okay? And once again, almost all that we know about Kush comes from Egyptian sources, which indicate that it was an economic center that operated a lucrative market in ivory, incense, iron, and especially gold. This is where the Egyptians got their gold from, was Kush, which is along the Nile River, but just south of what we today call ancient Egypt. And there's a good map of it. Ancient Egypt, and here you can see what Kush would be. Now these are pyramids of ancient Kush, and obviously you can see the influence of Egyptian culture here. When we think of pyramids like this, we think of it only in Egypt. Now this is interesting because later in Egyptian history, Kush actually conquered Egypt. And here we have an example of a black queen, which says a lot about the pharaohs and the black influence on ancient Egypt. Now, probably the most famous of all the African kingdoms is the Kingdom of Mali. And once again, remember I said, think of this as a text. You can read this at your leisure. But the point here is, like, if I said to you, why is this important? It's important because it was so sophisticated. It had a library. They were known for their wealth. And probably one of the richest kings in all of the world happened to be an African king. Okay, so once again, it goes against this myth that African culture was primitive. Africans did not have a civilization. That's why this is important that you know this. Okay, there's again how big it was, the Mali Empire, and there's Timbuktu. That was a city I showed you before. And there it is. Socorro University. Most Americans have no clue that in Africa, one of the oldest universities in the world is to be found. Now, the Quran, of course, is the holy book of Muslims, of Islam. And so this is, we've been an Islamic university. I think it's kind of cool. Look at, they say, however, secular teaching, which means non-religious, such as they taught things like geometry and mathematics, and it also stressed to develop a well-rounded individual. That's why you're taking history, by the way. I'm sure many of you are not going to be history majors, but we want you to be well-rounded, well-educated, and have a collective memory of your past and how that influences your life today, okay? And this is the man, the richest king in the world. Who would have guessed, right? From Africa, Mansa Musa, okay? And this tells you a little bit about how wealthy he was. He decided, like all good Muslims, to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. And you can see this, he was a rock star, basically. When he arrived in Egypt, even the Sultan was astonished by the wealth of this West African king. He had 100 camels carrying 135 kilos or 300 pounds of gold dust, while 500 slaves each brandished a 2.7 kilo, 6 pounds of gold stuff. By the way, notice the word slaves. Let me say something about this because this will be important. This whole course is going to seem to dominate American history is going to be slavery and the whole dilemma of slavery. But slavery is as old as civilizations, I guess. In the ancient world, I mean, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, slavery was the main economic system, as slavery dominated the American South and the United States economic system in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. However, slavery would be different in Islamic culture than, let's say, later in European or American culture. You should realize that slavery is something very, it was everywhere pretty much at that point. But it's safe to say that the way the Europeans enslaved Africans and brought them over to what will someday be the United States was much more negative, much more horrific than the kind of slavery you would have found in, let's say, the Islamic countries. And there's this sign, a picture of, there he is, Mansa Musa with a gold nugget. Okay. Okay, what made Africa so rich? Basically, it's two things, gold and salt. This is where Europeans got much of their gold. The Romans, for example, before the New World. You'll find later some of the greatest gold or silver deposits will be in South America and Mexico. But remember, they didn't know about Mexico and South America then. So here you have, and salt. Now, salt looks like this, large slabs of salt. And needless to say, salt was so important in Europe because that's how you prepared meat, right? You salted it so it wouldn't go bad. And it was that more than anything else. And how did they get it to Europe or to, let's say, to the Islamic civilizations to the east, over the desert? Well, there you go, the camel. The animal perfectly evolved to deal with desert conditions. Their feet are wide so they don't, think of almost like a snowshoe impact on the desert floor. They don't sink. And their eyelids have an extra filtering eyelid to keep out the sand during a sandstorm, perfectly adapted to life in the desert. And these caravans brought mostly salt and gold, as you can see, to other locations. Okay. And there's a good example of the trade routes to Mecca. And there's Mecca, the holiest city for Muslims. And there's Cairo in Egypt. And you can see it also goes up here, Algeria and Tunis, where Islamic traders could also eventually bring it into Europe. Okay. This was the basis of their wealth, gold and salt. This is a picture of their mosque at Timbuktu. It's still there. This is a modern picture, so you can see. This was one of the oldest universities. It's also a mosque university complexes in the world. Okay. picture of it. Okay, why is this section on African civilization important? Well, I've been hinting at it quite a while now. This is, if you haven't written it down, here's an opportunity. This was a flourishing, sophisticated area of civilized, progressive kingdoms. Many of them, like in Europe and everywhere in the world, human beings like to fight each other. And in many cases, this will also be their downfall, constant fighting and so forth. But it's very important that American slavery is based on a myth that Africans were uncivilized. They came from, that they didn't know how to take care of themselves. They were like children. And this helped white Europeans, I think, and white Americans to enslave them. Here's another example of their sophistication. They knew about astronomy and mathematics. This is basically Islamic notes on algebra. And once again, another caravan showing caravan routes, which are so important to explain why they're so important. If you're not sure where Egypt is, there it is. There's Arabia, Ethiopia, Morocco up here in Europe. This is the way to get to Europe. Okay, mentioned already Islam. Islam is going to be probably the most advanced civilization in the world, with the exception of China. And we owe so much to this civilization that probably Columbus's voyage in 1492 would not have been possible without the contributions that the Islamic world made. Okay, so what's going to follow next is just a list of some of their inventions and some of their contributions. So it's not like you have to know them all, but it's also important that you see how large this empire was. Muhammad is the person who basically inspired and started the Islamic religion, that the angels from God, Allah, as he would have been called, came and spoke to him. And what he learned from God basically becomes written down as the Quran, which would be comparable to the Christian Bible. And of course, then they went on a crusade, shall we say, where they spread the faith. In many cases, it's one of the largest empires ever in terms of its size, much larger even than the Roman Empire. And the reason it spread so fast and so far is probably because the way they treated the people they conquered, they basically, as long as they accepted Islam, were treated well. And even if they didn't accept Islam, they were not tortured or killed. They were maybe heavily taxed more, that's all. And a lot of the governments that were corrupt. And so when Islam rode through this area, in many cases, they had a lot of popular support. Okay. There's another way of looking at the Islamic world, and much of that is the way it is today. Okay. Now, later, the Ottoman Empire, which was basically a Turkish tribe, also became powerful, but that's also, they accepted Islam. So this is still looking at the rise of Islamic power. And as you can see, Europe was threatened by the Ottomans. And for many years, the Ottomans will try to conquer Europe. I think, Paul, call your attention to this little bit of Spain right here. See, even part of Spain was part of the Muslim empire, if you want to call it that. And if they'd broken through, there's a lot of mountains here, and there's a fortress called Vienna. If they'd taken Vienna, maybe they would have spread all the way through Europe, and we would all be Muslims today if that had occurred. Now there's Spain. Now the reason I'm focusing on Spain, of course, is Spain eventually, when they get their act together and unify the peninsula, this is where Ferdinand and Isabella, a king and queen, will, Isabella was the queen of Castile, which is up here, see, Castile, and Aragon, which is over here, was the king, King Ferdinand. They will eventually reconquest this, we'll call it. They conquered all of Spain, and that's where they finally will take a chance on Columbus's weird idea that he could find China and the spices and goods from China by going west and not having to rely on Islamic middlemen anymore. So let's take a look at their contributions. Once again, you don't need me for many of these. If I go a little bit too fast, just slow it down, go get a coffee, take a break, come back later. This is a key point I want you to write down. Much of European exploration and later Europe's Renaissance, which means their rebirth, and they start to become strong and flourish in terms of philosophy and art and culture and everything, could not have happened without what they got from the Islamic world. So once again, this is as true today as back then. Globalization overall has been good for the world. This is how we pick up new ideas, and it's still going on today, of course. Okay. Medicine, many achievements. They were the first to use anesthesia in surgery. Europeans didn't know how to do that. They knew how to cauterize a wound. Europeans did not know how to do that. And they discovered that epidemics arise from contagions through touch and air. Think of COVID right now. What are you supposed to do? Wear a mask, keep a distance, wash your hands. These were the first people that had a concept of this. Europeans had no clue about germs, about cleanliness at all. Okay. Astronomy. Once again, without these instruments, Columbus could not have sailed westward. The astrolabe, as you can see here, with precise time of sunrises and sunsets, helped determine the period of feasting during the month of Ramadan. That's why they needed it. But also, it's a way to tell when you're going east to west where you are. The compass, the astrolabe, all very important to help discover the new world. And that last part here, a very famous Biruni, Islamic scientist, showed how the Earth rotates on his own axis. Theory proven by Galileo 6 centuries later, 600 years later. They also gave us Arabic numerals. The Hindus, however, added 1, 0. But 1 through 9, we have to thank the Arabs for that. Notice the connection. Arabic numerals, Arab. Algebra, well, the name gives it away, right? And they led the world in things like algebra, advances geometry, and trigonometry, all things, of course, that will be important for the European discoveries and breakthroughs. The scientific method. Every science book I know talks about this. So if you've taken a science course in high school or BCC or any other university, you know what I'm talking about. You observe, you ask questions, you form a hypothesis, and then you have to test that. You make a prediction based on the hypothesis, and then you test the prediction. Think about what we're doing right now, right? COVID, vaccinations. What did we go through to get these, like Moderna, for example, or Pfizer, vaccinations ready for the public? They use the scientific method. It's about science. Okay. Very famous encyclopedia about medicine. It's become some basic medical text in the West for 5 centuries. And much of this just kind of repeats what I've already said, okay? Germ theory. You believe that people can transmit disease to others by breath, noted contagion with tuberculosis, and discussed the transmission of disease through water and dirt. Okay. Ibsina, very important. Hospital, once again, this is an Islamic contribution. Hopefully you never have to go to a hospital. If you go to one, thank the Arabs, thank the Muslims, okay? It's essential for several purposes: central medical treatment, convalescence, recovering from illness, accidents, insane asylum, a retirement home, all things that they came up with first, okay? And especially needs for an aged and infirm who lacked a family to care for them. Mental illness, this is one of the first civilizations to deal with mental illness, that they should be treated humanely and be kept under care, either a guardian or in the state. In Europe, they would have been said, they must be under the control of the devil, let's burn them, you know, this type of thing. They're so far ahead in terms of how Europeans thought back then. Modern psychology, you can base this a lot on the Muslim breakthroughs. Once again, you can read this at your own leisure. Islamic surgery, cataract surgery. They're the first ones to be able to take a cataract from the eye, and that's one of the instruments they used. And they also understood pretty much how the human eye works. I think most of you should know that when light comes into your eye, it's all screwed up, and it's your eye, your brain, that then puts it together to see what you see as you look at this page, for example. Okay. Cuisine. I know a lot of you like to eat. Think of the foods that the Arabs passed on to us and the names: rice, sesame, pepper, ginger, cloves, melons, shallots. You can read this on and on. Europe didn't have any of these things. Can you imagine when they first tasted some of these things and they wanted them? How did they get them? It had to be through trade. Okay. Now, how did the Europeans first find about this? Well, once again, in a world history course, you would have studied the Crusades, when Jerusalem, the most holy of cities in Christendom, was taken over by the Muslims, of course, Europeans got together and sent crusading armies to try to win back Jerusalem. And the process, in the long run, they failed, but in the process, they also came in contact with Islamic culture and foods, and they obviously brought back to Europe a taste for these things. Okay. Napoleon Bonaparte, famous French, meaning, I'm not sure he was a good Catholic, but certainly a Christian background. When he was in Egypt, this is what he wrote. And so he was that impressed with the Arab, or I should say the Islamic religion and the principle of the Quran, which seemed to be much more tolerant, okay, than his own Christianity. Music, the guitar, okay, piano, percussion instruments, all we owe to the Muslim culture. Cosmetics, hair dyes, body oils, perfumes, once again, thank the Muslims. And this is something really big, and you'll see this as we go through the course. They were very religiously tolerant. They didn't burn people as a norm of different religions. They were tolerant. Later, when the Jews were being kicked out of Spain, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feelings was very high in Christian countries. They were welcomed in the Islamic world. Freedom of religion. Muslim world was sanctuary of the Jews during centuries of persecution, very important. They had no ethnic or racial discrimination based on religion, human rights. Other Arab words, cotton. How about soda? Yeah, that's another Arab word for you. Carbonated drink started in the Arab world, and cola was brought by West African slaves to the South, the birthplace of Coca-Cola. Okay, so there's another example of world trade, the cola plant coming from Africa, and of course then the Muslims turned it into a drink. Here's some other words from the Middle East. See, I know you recognize this. Impact on trade and spread of ideas. Okay, once again, read this at your own leisure. Trade barriers were few, which made trading easy. And here's another key breakthrough. Instead of paying always with cash, they came up with a neat idea called paying with checks. Checks is an Arab word, and you know how a check works. You use these all the time, or letters of credit. And this really helped spread trade and make trade more efficient throughout the Muslim world. And eventually, of course, it spread to Europe. Okay. This is how ideas spread. This is how goods from China, for example, reached Europe as well. Now, the Chinese merchant himself did not go all the way to, let's say, Europe, but he would go in through China and then trade it to an Arab merchant, and the Arab merchant would then trade it maybe to a Persian merchant and so forth until it finally reached, and you can see the gateway through Spain here. Notice the importance of this. Look at that last sentence. Some of this wealth spilled over into Europe, and along with scientific knowledge the Arabs passed on to Europe, helped to fuel the continent's renaissance. So that's the key thing about this golden age of the Muslim empire. Without them, Europe could not have maybe put together their own scientific breakthroughs and eventually age of exploration. Okay, now we move to, they introduced paper to the West. Europe did not have paper. What did they use? Well, the Romans used to use clay tablets, but more often too, they would use animal skin that was dried and flattened and squeezed, and we call that parchment, but that was actually animal skin. Think of, you take it for granted, but think what an incredible invention paper is, how light it is, how durable it can be, and how easy it is to communicate on paper. Now, notice I said they introduced paper to the West, but they didn't invent paper. But paper allowed the development, of course, of books. And books, I love books, by the way. I'm a great reader. This will spread knowledge, of course, and without the books and knowledge, our civilization would never have advanced. And once again, okay, shipbuilding. Columbus's ship, the caravels, would not have been possible without Arab designs. And so you can read this at your own leisure. The trade routes, very important. So look at the first sentence. The great journeys of discovery that were undertaken by the Europeans in the 15th century, whether on the Cape or across to the Americas, was based in large measure on this Indian Ocean technology. The Indian Ocean is the ocean between Africa and, say, India, okay? And you can see it right here, the Indian Ocean. And you can see that, once again, the trade routes, how extensive their trade routes were by water and by land. But now we come to the last one, and this is the superpower. Number one, the Chinese Empire. It's interesting that if you look at China today, they have the world's second largest economy. And it's very interesting, our relationship with China today. We need them, they need us, but also there's that competition. And our dilemma is, how do we deal with China? Because we both depend on it. President Trump's trade wars have not been successful. China has actually improved their trade relationships. We might say the balance of trade is in their favor versus in our favor. If you go to Walmart, for example, almost everything in Walmart comes from China. Now, to show you how sophisticated they were, look at the size of a Chinese junk or warship or merchant ship, and look at the size of Columbus's ship. This is 900 years in advance in terms of technology versus what Columbus had or Europe. And if the Chinese had wanted to, they could have circumnavigated the world. They could have discovered the new world. We could be speaking Chinese today, but the Chinese had everything, okay? Remember, the thing about this, all these civilizations, I want you to write this down, is they're all fairly sophisticated and doing well. The one civilization that's not is Europe. They're like have-nots. They don't have any money. They don't have a lot of the resources. And so, but in many ways, being poor is what's going to spur them to try to get a hold of these riches. But look at the kind of difference in technology. There's another example of it. Now, what were the Chinese contributions? Well, they had things that Europe didn't know how to make or didn't have. The compass is a Chinese invention. Without the compass, once again, no discovery. And Europe were eating out of wooden mugs and wooden dishes. Can you imagine an English or French king seeing something like this called porcelain or china, delicate as eggshell, beautiful patterns, and they did not know how to make it. They had no clue. So obviously people with money wanted to get a hold of this porcelain. And then finally, even bigger, spices. All the spices that you like, many of you like spicy foods, none of them were in Europe. They all came out of what we call Asia, if not in China, in what we call like the Spice Islands and so forth. And also the Chinese knew how to make silk, the silkworm. Now Europeans were wearing woolens, okay? Even woolen underwear, they had wool underwear. Here's the Chinese wearing something as light, as beautiful, and smooth to the skin as silk. And if you've ever had anything silk on, you know what I mean. They know how to make this in Europe. And so tremendous demand for these luxury items. And once again, how did they get them? Through the Silk Road mostly. And once again, China through, and by the way, China today is building a new Silk Road based on high-speed trains. And this is going to be really help their economy a lot and may lead us in second place, because China is very much involved in trying to dominate the trade today, as they did back in the 1200s, 1000s, and even earlier. And there's Italy, which will be the benefactor of this and start what we call the Renaissance, or rebirth. Printing, they're the ones who invented printing, block printing. And without block printing, you would not have books as well, right? There it is, printing and paper. And thank God they invented toilet paper. Now you might be wondering, what did Europeans use? Well, if they didn't have toilet papers, what did they use? They used leaves, they used, if they had any old paper, of course, paper was very valuable. So they might use a brush, or if all else failed, you can always just use your hands and then hopefully wash them afterwards. But the Chinese thought Europeans were disgusting. Europeans never bathed. Like I said, hygiene was non-existent. But next time you use toilet paper, thank the Chinese. And finally, gunpowder, which I shouldn't have to make the point. They used it mostly for demonstrations and firecrackers, but Europeans will put it to good use to kill each other, of course, and weapons. Once again, China was so powerful and they had everything, and they had no enemies around them to speak of, and they built the Great Wall of China to keep marauding nomads from breaking through. There was no incentive to really go exploring. They felt like, we got it all. Why do we want to go exploring anywhere? Which in the long run will hurt them, okay? And there's an early rocket, as you can see, and gun. So here's Europe at the end. Look how Europe looks a little bit different back then. Look at the Muslim influence right here, Caliphate here. Now this is the Eastern Roman Empire. It's called Byzantium. And if you have any friends who are Greek or Russian, this will be called the Russian or the Greek Orthodox Church, okay? It's Christian, and this is Catholic. Remember, no Protestants yet. no Methodists, no Baptists, no nothing, Catholics. And eventually the word Frank will become Frankreich, Kingdom of the Franks. These were all basically tribes. Eventually they consolidate into countries. Anglo-Saxons are usually always associated to this day with the English. Celts, think of the Boston Celtics, Celts. Think of Irish and Scotland. Okay, Franks would be the tribe for the French. Burgundy is another one. And the Germanic tribes here. Slavs would be Russian, Bulgaria, Slavs. See? This is what basically Europe looked like. And in the Middle Ages, well, we always associate them with knights and castles, right? We always associate them with these two things. And it was a civilization. I mean, to put it down, if you look at some of the great cathedrals they built, and even that castle, there was technology there. There was possibilities. But as you can see, I list a whole mess of contributions from Africa, from Europe and China. They needed those as well, okay? And this is why finally in the 1400s, late 1400s into the 1500s, with the help of Chinese and Islamic contributions, there was this rebirth in which Europe started to take off finally in terms of scientific pursuits. And also when I say it's recognition of its own heritage, the idea that the Greco-Roman culture, which was rediscovered in many cases by Islamic scholars when they conquered that area, and then translated the Greek classics into Arabic, and later Europeans found out about Aristotle and so forth by rewriting them into their native language of mostly Latin, but also maybe French for English. This is where we end this first PowerPoint. Okay, it's not a major contender in global dominance yet, but Europe will soon start to feel its own strength grow. And this is where we'll later. Now, you might say, what does this have to do with US history? This is part of that context I told you about. The next PowerPoint goes to look at how Europe was having some internal problems. This will also help with the desire of colonization. But the bottom line is from this PowerPoint is because they didn't have a lot and they wanted all these goods, they're finally able to think about, can we get to China from another direction without having to trade first through the Muslims, okay, who are also getting a cut. If we can go to China another way, well, we'll save a lot of money. The Portuguese will try to do this by going south of Africa and seeing if you could go around Africa. No one knew if you could yet. And of course, Columbus will come to the idea of going directly west. And he had no idea how big the earth was back then, or that there were two continents in his way. So once again, take it slow. This seems kind of long, but just do a little bit at a time, okay? Like my mother always used to say, when you do your work, any kind of work, do a little bit and rest. And also don't put things off to the very end, because then you feel more pressure and so forth. So I hope this helped, and have a good evening.